Now, to help untangle all the ins and outs of everything that was discussed around the G7 summit, I'm joined by Joel Trachtman. He is the professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Joel, as always, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. I want to begin by talking about the G7 came and went. Leaders clearly wanted the discussions to go smoothly, obviously rattled about further upsetting the financial markets that were reeling from the prolonged U.S.-China trade war. If you look what happened Monday, U.S. finished in positive territory, but in Europe, still a certain degree of hesitation. Did the leaders at the G7 get what they wanted?
Well, they got what they wanted in terms of a peaceful, not very contentious G7, with the exception of what I understand to be discussions about Russia's re-entry. It seems to have been peaceful. President Trump didn't walk away at any particular moment. He didn't complain strongly. So that was an accomplishment in the current era.
Okay, let's pick up on U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, upon exiting, he offered a hint of positive news about the ongoing trade dispute between China and the United States, saying that progress could be made in the ongoing discussions. The concern being Trump is known to say one thing in front of leaders, appearing to appease them, and then something entirely different on Twitter once he returns to Washington. So what do you make of the positive comments Trump made in France, and what do people need to look at ahead?
It's a good question, and as you know, he's been going back and forth, escalating last week, getting upset when China responded last week, and then saying in a meeting at Biarritz that he had second thoughts about the escalation, and then walking that back and saying those second thoughts were about whether he should have had more intense response to the Chinese moves. But then the latest thing, as you mentioned, is that he said that there had been communications from China saying they want to come back to the table. Separately, Liu He, the Chinese lead negotiator, said in a meeting in China that he was interested in orderly negotiations, and Trump picked up on that and said, yes, we are also. So I think what's going on is that Trump wanted to appear reasonable to the rest of the world, and is trying to make himself out as a great negotiator, a good international president in anticipation of the coming United States elections.
Well, let's take a closer look at what China has at stake in all this right now. Clearly, it is in their best interest and everybody's best interest to resolve this. What is China doing at this point? You talked about the lead negotiator reaching out. To what degree is that helping? Do you think that's going to calm markets? And are you hopeful that we'll see some kind of positive movement in this ahead of the shopping holidays coming up at the end of the year?
My sense is that the markets have already taken into account a great deal of uncertainty. So anything that suggests that the uncertainty will be resolved positively or that things won't get worse is a positive message for the market. As you know, President Trump held back on the greatest part of the increase in tariffs relating to consumer goods like electronics, clothing, shoes, until after the Christmas imports in December. And so I think that's an attempt to reduce the pain to the United States. It's an implicit admission that these tariffs are not being paid by the Chinese exporters, at least not exclusively, but are being borne by the United States consumers as well. So we'll see, what happens. I think President Trump may be frightened of the prospect of a recession and may be thinking that if there is a recession, which could be accentuated by these tariffs, he wouldn't be reelected. And so that may be what's driving him. It's hard to say.
And consider all the leaders at the G7 as well, with Brexit being concerned, the financial concerns in Europe. To what degree do you think that is affecting U.S. President Donald Trump, and how much is this trade war dragging down the global market?
Well, I think the European leaders are concerned, especially Boris Johnson in his meeting with President Trump said, he used the word sheepishly, that we're not happy with tariffs. And indeed, Boris Johnson is thinking about a Brexit, which would lead the United Kingdom to have to trade increasingly with the rest of the world, less intensively with the European Union. And if that trade is reduced because of the United States-China trade war, it would be bad for Britain and bad for the global economy as a whole.
And what about the word coming out that the United States could be open to discussions with Iran? How significant is that, considering how many nations support reviving the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, as you know, President Trump campaigned against the agreement with Iran, and he pulled the United States out of it and started imposing sanctions on Iran. And I think it is very interesting that he's turning back and saying maybe we can speak with Rouhani. He didn't object when Iran's foreign minister showed up in Biarritz. And maybe, again, this is him trying to make himself out as a great international negotiator who can do something. Of course, this problem as it stands now is a problem of his making, although perhaps he's hoping to get what in his mind would be a better deal than the one President Obama had negotiated.
Or at least one with his signature on it, right? I also want to talk about the G7 weighing in on the horrific wildfires in the Amazon region, offering an aid package. But interestingly, that followed a meeting that Trump skipped. There remains this broad disconnect between Europe, China, and others concerned about the climate, while Brazil's new president vows to open up the Amazon for development, and Trump, as you know, has called climate change a hoax. So where does this leave global leaders?
The G7 it had earlier numbers, lower numbers, started as a club for liberal democracies to cooperate to start to solve global problems. Global warming would be a very important thing to address at the G7. President Trump doesn't believe it's human-caused. He doesn't want to address it, and he absented himself from that meeting. The G7 agreed to devote a paltry $20 million to assist in these horrible wildfires, these fires in Brazil, when this is an enormous problem that the world should be moving forward to address more explicitly. And of course, Bolsonaro is more in the Trump nationalist camp and doesn't want to address these things.
Indeed, Joel, that fire is up by 86% over last year in terms of fires. Joel Trachtman, as always, thanks very much for bringing all this into focus. We really appreciate it.